I'm Michelle Perro. I am an integrative pediatrician for 40 years. I run various websites. I'm an author and a proponent of educating families on food as medicine.
I'm John Travers. I was trained in preventive medicine at Johns Hopkins because I found I couldn't handle giving drugs to people as an intern. And that led me to starting the first wellness center in the world right down the road in Mill Valley in 1975, and to a series of different careers, both with adults and children. Infant wellness seemed to be more important than adult wellness when I met Gene Liedloff and learned about the continuum concept. And now my main concern is how pharmacology, big pharma, has taken over medicine. It's run by corporations. The doctor-patient relationship has been destroyed in California because of AB 2098. Doctor can't give you the information that will give you true informed consent. And so I created a website called vaccinefacts.info, and I'm adamant about we've got to wake people up. In Australia, where I live half the year, there's a lot more people waking up. And in Europe, we just learned that there's lawsuits underway.
So if people want to know, like, why are we here? Why are you and I here, two seasoned physicians chatting about this, is because we have concerns of the pharma narrative that has driven not just this pandemic, or however you want to view it, but the narrative since Rockefeller took over the
Flexner Report.
With the Flexner Report in 1910. So we've been on this pharma-driven narrative that has literally corrupted and colluded with medical schools to provide that one philosophy.
Yeah.
And people like you and me, when we challenge this for whatever concerns we have, based on the science, we're ridiculed, censored, or labeled as anti-science. And nothing could be further than the truth, because Jack, I've spoke to you many times and you are not anti-science.
Yeah, it's like the true science, the vaccine science, that there are thousands of studies that show that conventional vaccines have serious problems with them. And now we have the mRNA fake vaccines that are really genetic tools that are causing problems in like a high percentage, almost 100% of kids are having elevated troponin levels. We've seen young athletes dropping dead on the field, performers. I just saw a list of 35 performers that have died, big names. So, and you work with kids.
I do, and I am greatly concerned. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, MIT researcher, and I wrote a joint paper together on this last June 2021 called Pediacide. And once those reports of cardiac involvement post-jab started coming out rapidly, and right now there are thousands on the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, that when another vaccine came out in the past, rotavirus vaccine, 8 cases of issues, intussusception, pulled. That was 1998. Fast forward now, 2022, we have thousands of injuries in children and adults, not pulled. And additionally,
hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands of, and we would have more kids, but it just got approved in children. We're going to have more. The tsunami of childhood demise is just about to start, because children should not be receiving an unstudied experimental immunomodulatory jab when the risk does not outweigh the benefit. They don't have a risk. Their risk of issues from COVID are less than 0.004%.
Tiny.
Very tiny. So everything we do, Jack, is about analyzing this risk-benefit ratio. And clearly, in the case of the COVID jab, truly, it's a genetic therapy. It's not a true vaccine. It's to say faulty would be a mild expression of how awful this experiment is.
And people don't realize that it's an experiment. You know, they think because we've been lied to, and this just is, in the original studies, it was well known in 2021 that they never tested for transmission or for preventing. It was all about reducing symptoms, and yet all of the big names, including President Biden, have said if you get the jab, you won't get the disease. And every one of those is a lie. And now in Europe, in the European Senate, They just questioned a Pfizer representative who admitted on camera, no, we never did. We never tested it, like it was big news. But we knew this all along, and now it's coming out, and they're suing.
Told us.
And so
You don't get vaccinated just for yourself, but also for others. You do it for all of society. That's what I said. Today, this turned out to be complete nonsense. In a COVID hearing in the European Parliament, one of the Pfizer directors just admitted to me, at the time of introduction, the vaccine had never been tested on stopping the transmission of the virus.
Voor u, mevrouw Small, heb ik de volgende vraag waar ik een duidelijk antwoord op wil. And I will speak in English so there are no misunderstandings. Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it's entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market.
This is scandalous. Millions of people worldwide felt forced to get vaccinated because of the myth that you do it for others. Now this turned out to be a cheap lie.
Because of the events unfolding after the committee session of last Monday. Put in a nutshell, the cat is out of the bag. It was a gigantic lie, what they told us, that these vaccines would prevent you catching this virus or would prevent transmission. Well, none of that was true, as it turns out, and based on that lie, all of the mandates, all of the lockdowns, all of the non-pharmaceutical measures as wearing masks, staying at home, curfews, all of that was based on that gigantic lie.
And so this is the question, this is the parallel conversation. Where's the liability? Where's the accountability? Yeah. And no one's done, in my opinion, a better job than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I just recently watched his two, Part 1 and Part 2 docuseries on Fauci and this debacle of what's probably been planned for years, if you follow the timelines, as proposed by Dr. David Martin and Karen Kingston and others. And it's like a patent parade. You can see the timeline for years. None of this is novel, none is new. These viruses have been manipulated, genetically engineered for years. The research has been going on for years. Illegally. And this is and we as clinicians have been kind of forced to try to uncover as CSI agents what they did, why they did it, what's in those injections. It's been nothing more than this grandiose Michael Crichton novel. That's what I feel like we're living. A bad version of Jurassic Park.
I mean, this is what's shocking, is it's really a genocide of children.
And when we look back clinically of, even here locally in our hometown of Marin, we didn't see any in different practices where I was involved, no problems with COVID. The kids sailed through it. But I myself have seen quite a few vaccine reactions, and parents are going to be forced with an extra dilemma because the healthcare providers are not acknowledging that these are vaccine reactions. And even when they do, now they're going to be held, maybe get their licenses revoked because of what you just previously mentioned, AB 2098, where we can get our licenses revoked if we go against the narrative for misinformation. I'm not sure who's dictating what's misinformation.
If the lawsuits don't shut it down, because it's truly illegal. And
it is illegal.
The ICANN Informed Consent Action Network, ICANN, they're planning to sue every state that follows California's example of do people even know what we haven't said what this is, that a doctor can't talk about anything that doesn't agree with the narrative, or their license is threatened, which is criminal and illegal.
And illegal, correct.
Whether it'll hold up or not, but some other states, about 30 of them have promised they won't do that, but the others may well follow California. And
what's interesting is, not only that is horrific, but many physicians were not aware of this legislation. I don't know how that's possible, because I was having nightmares about it all the time, that it was going to thoroughly decimate the physician-patient relationship.
They didn't know about it.
This intrusion. How could other practitioners not appreciate what was happening and how we were being censored within our own clinics, even to question? And this is the very heart of scientific democracy, discourse. And we're not being allowed to question what everything should be questioned. Because I tell my patients, question everything. Because what I'm telling you now in a year may not be true. And things I said 10 years ago now are not true. So medicine is an art. It's constantly in transition and evolving. And so that limits and inhibits our ability to have true, meaningful medical discourse.
True. Well, and the lying about the statistics. You know, as I said, I live in Australia half the year. I'm part of the COVID medical network there, where a top pharmacist, PhD, one of the leading guys developing drugs for years, just laid the whole thing out in front of one of the annual meetings. And a study, just a poll of, I think, 45,000 Australians, 37% were not vaccinated at all, and yet the government says 95% of Australia is vaccinated. And I'm hearing the same figures about Marin, but we don't have the poll. We don't know what's really true. The reality and the statistics that we're being given by the media, which are owned by pharma, people don't realize that 70% of the income of all the major news networks comes from pharma. So they're not going to speak up. And
this was, you know, so we have this obfuscation of truth. We don't know what the truth is. And it's happening here in our own local county, Jack. A couple of weeks ago in our local Marin Independent Journal, there was a full-page ad that, gee, if you're having cardiac symptoms, it could be this rare type of amyloid cardiomyopathy, of amyloid depositing in the heart. And we now know from coroner's offices, not from autopsy, which because a lot of our people who died of COVID were not allowed to get, autopsied, which is another issue, that they were pulling out these amyloid clots. So who sponsors this full-page ad? And I thought, what? Rare cardiac amyloidopathy in people when they're having cardiac symptoms? So we're trying to create a new disease to cover our tracks for real? Pfizer. Pfizer paid for the ad. People looking at it saying, wow, isn't this great? We're going to pick up on these people who've had this rare cardiomyopathy. And so we're doing the same thing with children. In June, what do I read about? A new stroke drug out for children. Children don't get strokes.
We're trying to normalize.
Normalizing these issues, which are side effects from the experimental immunomodulatory jabs. Children do not get strokes. Children do not get a myocarditis, 1 in 200,000 children. So now to have all these kids with myocarditis, it's rare. Strokes in children, the only ones who really have strokes are often preemies at birth from intraventricular bleeds. Very rare in children. So trying to normalize these things is absolutely, in my opinion, criminal.
Truly criminal.
This is criminal act. And so then, but because the media, as you so aptly pointed out, is controlled, and if you're only looking at CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post, also owned by various people, you will only get one narrative.
Exactly. Not only the media, but the regulatory agencies are infiltrated and have a revolving door where the executives, you leave the CDC and you get a top job at Pfizer or Merck. And it's so infiltrated and captured that they're not looking out for us, they're looking out for their handlers.
And search engines on your internet. So my husband and he said, I wanted to show him something, and he Googled it. He said, doesn't exist. I said, well, what search engine are you using? Changed search engines, and lo and behold, there it was.
There it is, yeah.
So this is, I don't know if people realize the extent of how controlled the narrative is. And there are physicians like you and me, and we are trying with many, many others that people may not be hearing about because many are losing their licenses, and trying to explain that we're questioning this because some of us, I know I have, I read the Pfizer and Moderna studies. So if physicians are administering experimental therapies, I say, well, what did you think of the data? You looked at the science, right? You know, that's a fair question. When you think you have a new experimental therapy, let's look at the science.
Yes and no, but in medical school, how much vaccine theory did you learn?
Well, I'm a pediatrician, so we learned some, but it was all from the CDC and the Red Book.
Well, in my training, there was none.
Oh, we had some,
Yeah.
but we used the CDC's book called the Red Book, and that was kind of our vaccine Bible. And I carried that thing around with me in my early training days because it had all the vaccine information and a lot of infectious disease information. Little did I know what the origins were. And I wonder, too, were these organizations always so infiltrated and so corrupt, or did it evolve to this?
I think it evolved.
That's what I think, too. I don't believe that they were always this bad.
No, it's... I mean, the corporatocracy that we live in, they've infiltrated everything, not just the CDC and the FDA, but the FFA and the EPA. They've all been infiltrated by the corporations that they're supposed to be regulating.
Yes. And we saw this when we were doing the GMO work, which has become like such a, it seems like a non-issue compared to what we're dealing with now, but all the regulatory agencies were co-opted. Including the EPA and the USDA. Yes.
It's sad, and what do we do?
So, you know, this is a good opportunity for us to talk about what has been revealed, you know, through this pharma morass, and how we can help educate people to navigate what has been revealed, because there is an upside for COVID, if you can believe it. We have an upside. But all this business,
the Great Awakening
has been exposed in a way we may not have seen before. So now we have an opportunity here. I'm going to sound like Joe Biden now, Build Back Better. We have an opportunity to improve on what we've learned. We have to take this information to our advantage. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, the fact that over half of Americans have said they won't get any more jabs, any more boosters, that's radical. I don't think it's true here in Marin, but across the country, the clear failure of them is becoming so obvious that they can't hide it any longer. The statistics have been there all along in the original studies that it didn't work, but now from experience, it's more and more difficult to hide it. So that is a big plus. Plus it reflects on the childhood vaccine schedule. Now that they've added this to the childhood schedule with an attempt to be able to avoid liability, it's not going to work. I mean, it's like, I think, too much. It's the straw that's going to break the camel's back. But what's been happening is, until recently, we had no idea, except for a few pediatricians who had unvaccinated kids in their practices and saw that they were much healthier than the vaccinated kids. That wasn't known. I read it in one of Tom Cowan's books 3 years ago. What? I didn't know that. Well, hardly any pediatricians had unvaccinated kids, so they wouldn't have known. And then my friend Paul Thomas up in Portland, he publishes the vaccine-friendly plan, which was a reduced level of the CDC. And the Oregon board had been after him for 5 years to support his assertions that his program was as safe as the CDC program, which has no safety studies. So what's he going to compare it to, one that doesn't exist? Anyway, he finally gets a researcher to work with him, and they go through 10,000 patients that were born into his practice over 10 years, and they find this enormous difference in the unvaccinated and the partially vaccinated. Almost all of them are only partially vaccinated. In all these other diseases, the charts are amazing. I've got it on my website. And 5 days after he publishes this paper, the Oregon board pulls his license. And they have been harassing him now for 3 years, and their medical board, it's basically a kangaroo court. He's given up the fact that he's not going to be able to retain his license, but he's also suing them for $35 million for the criminal acts that they've been doing. So it's putting a crack in the door of these so-called regulatory agencies that are really just serving big pharma. And it's leaking out everywhere. Then there's the book Turtles All the Way Down that was written by an Israeli of unknown origin, but it got written up in a respectable Israeli journal. Like the first time one of these had leaked into the main journals. And then an American version, Mary Holland, I think, did a lot of the translation. It's coming out. It's coming out amazingly.
Well, that Paul study, because Dr. Thomas study, and I love Paul, it revealed, because he looked at 2,000 kids, he found of 2,000 kids that he studied 10,000, of the 2,000, the unvaxxed and breastfed were the healthiest. And pediatricians don't know that. The fact that we can't have discourse about that is shocking, that why are these kids healthier? That should be looked at immediately. Yeah. So the real deal is we don't love our children here in America. If we did, we wouldn't have done the things we've done. We would have looked at data like that. We've seen this data before, even before Paul and Dr. Brian Hooker and others have published it. So if you really are telling me that we're pro-child here in the U.S., which I can't believe, we've been poisoning our children with various methods, both ingestion and injection-wise, for years, because the data is showing otherwise. We have our kids eating GMOs and pesticides since 1996. And glyphosate was shown in a paper in 2019 on how it causes autism. Not correlates, Jack, but causes. Big paper, and I thought there was going to be like, a big Broadway band come out, and there was nothing. Cricket, silence.
Exactly.
And we didn't change what we do. As a matter of fact, Moms Across America study, just published in September, showed that 93% of the school lunches they studied across the U.S., 93% of them contained pesticides, and more than one, and 100% of them contained heavy metals. So we are injecting toxic materials, neurotoxins. We are feeding our children that. And if you couple that with the tap water, it's not just Flint, Michigan, it's across the U.S. of ancient aging pipes and heavy metal contamination. We are literally causing a massive neurologic demise of our children, and we have so much data supporting that.
And the aluminum in the childhood vaccines, the toxic levels are way beyond what's...
And they show these toxic levels from institutions like Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP. They published and showed how much aluminum, for example, were in the first series that a baby might get at age 2 months, 1,200 mics. Adults don't get 1,200 mics of aluminum. And remember, it's not passing through the GI tract. We're injecting it.
Yeah.
So there's no detoxification bypass.
But they were making out that they were comparing it to ingested aluminum. That's criminal.
That's criminal. And for the experts who've been speaking out, like Dr. Exley, about the aluminum toxicity, totally,
lost his grants.
Lost his grants. So any scientist who has the gall to speak out against these narratives has their career hacked, they lose their credentials or ability to practice. They try to silence those who are bringing up, the data.
And the key player in this is Anthony Fauci with the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. Allergies, enormous number of allergies since the 90s, beginning with peanut oil in the vaccines and all, one of my granddaughters is peanut allergic, and you can't have peanuts on airplanes anymore or in the schools.
Yes.
And have they looked at any of that? No, it's a vaccine mill, this CHID.
We have when I was in Australia, every school in Australia that we were visiting had EpiPens for severe allergic reactions posted in like the teacher rooms. It was so profound. One in 13 children now has a severe life-threatening food allergy, and 90% of kids on the spectrum have gut intolerances, food intolerances, which are low-grade allergies. But we have to understand that all our children have chronic inflammation, and it's this combination of what we're feeding them, what they're drinking, and what we're injecting. And be clear. So environmental toxicants in all these formats with these experimental therapeutics for diseases that really we've confabulated in laboratories are harming our children. So I don't want to hear that America loves children. So this is a call to action for parents to take control of their own children and grandparents, for whatever we can do, to gain back our children's health. Because it's not government, It's certainly not regulatory agencies. Then who is protecting our children? It comes back to communities and families.
Yeah.
And I hope here in Marin that we could do a better job. This is a
You'd
shout
think
out to Marin.
Would be one of the shining examples, and it's the exact opposite. What happened?
It's hard to know what happened here because, and it's not like Marin children, considering the massive education and wealth that we have here in the county, that we have a seriously ill population of children here. And, you know, I would love to see those statistics. If you said, Michelle, what are they? I could tell you anecdotally of all the sick kids. I had a whole practice of treating complex, chronically ill children here in the county with a 1-year waiting list to see me. So there was no shortage of sick kids here in Marin when I was in practice. It's shocking. So it's not like our kids are faring better from all the experimental therapeutics we've given. Our kids are not doing better. And so parents should analyze why. Ask why. And if your pediatrician can't answer why, you have to think about what you need to do.
And on the subject of childhood vaccines, there's a little known fact that most people think that they were all tested against a control, like a normal saline control.
I'm glad you brought that up.
And none have been. And even the COVID ones, only one study was done, and that was because ICANN sued them and tried to get them to use a saline control. But what they use for the control is either the adjuvants, which are often worse than the vaccine itself, or another vaccine that's got problems. So you don't get that.
And in the Pfizer study, they injected the controls.
Yeah, so we lost the control group.
And they removed the control group.
Yeah.
So that is really bad science. So if we want to talk about what's good science, and that for us is a real problem because the science, I think Dr. Marcia Engel brought it up. She used to run New England Journal of Medicine. She was the editor-in-chief. And then there was so much corruption, she left and wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
So where we can get our science, people say, show me the data. I'm like, well, data may not be valid either. How about we talk about clinical experience and what we've seen? But if you even look at the Moderna study, 72% of the people enrolled in the Moderna vaccine trials had vaccine reactions. 72%. Now, they were graded into mild, moderate, and severe. I read 300 pages of the 1,000 pages that they did. I don't know why you need 1,000 pages on a study, but they only released, they got FOIA'd, and they only got released 300. But of the moderate and severe ones were mostly cardiac and neurologic. And what are we seeing now? And my neurology integrative colleagues tell me we're seeing a tsunami of neurologic disease in people, cardiac disease, and cancers, immune dysfunction.
Now, this is kids or across the
adults.
board? Yeah, adults.
Kids are having other issues, but the cardiac, no, they're having similar issues, but I haven't seen the cancer reports yet in children.
Right, but in terms of adults, my brother died a year ago, and he had a cancer that was under control, got jabbed, came back gangbusters. Another friend of my partner's, same thing. Doctors I know are finding a lot of the same thing, and the statistics aren't really being collected to know, but anecdotally people are saying the cancer rates are just skyrocketing.
Right. So what we're having is a nice correlation here when we look at introduction of experimental jabs and the rates of chronic disease. We have a great correlation curve. Causation, well, we can talk about it, right? But we can figure out studies to look at it.
Yeah.
And who's been reporting on this is mostly Dr. Ryan Cole from Idaho. And he's had a hell of a time in Idaho, but he's been reporting on this since the beginning. And Dr. Seneff actually has a paper with Dr. Nye, and she shows the mechanism of how this experimental therapy impairs immune function through manipulation of something called your toll receptors and your natural killer cells. And so we actually have the mechanisms on how it happens.
Well, and they need to suppress that part of the immune system in order to get the nanoparticles that carry the mRNA into the cells. So it's a deliberate shutdown of the immune system. And wouldn't they know this is going to happen? Robert Malone says yes, he told them early on and they ignored it.
And I hope everyone also appreciates that this nanotechnology is experimental and it's also inflammatory. And those small nanoparticles, which are like essentially 10 to the minus 9, cross the blood-brain barrier. And if you say, what are the effects on a developing brain? I don't know. We're not. I'd have to know by biopsy, because even MRIs wouldn't be sense enough, or PET scans, or any of the tools we have. What happens when these nanoparticles cross a developing, like, infant brain? They are now making vaccines with nanoaluminum, where that means the aluminum could cross directly into the blood-brain barrier.
Oh boy.
And it's clear evidence. There's clear evidence regarding the rising rates of Alzheimer's and aluminum toxicity. There is great data on that causation data, not correlation data.
So what are we going to do?
What do we do? What do we do?
Stand on our soapboxes on the street corners?
Well, I would say ask questions. I would tell people to question the narrative. Is this in your best interest? Everyone got injected, but everyone got COVID. So did the vaccine prevent you from getting COVID?
In fact, higher rates of getting COVID in England. That was the Lancet study from June. It's like, hello.
And the data shows that people who were sick in the ICUs were mostly vaccinated, not unvaccinated. And there was a higher death rate in the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. And there's great data out of the UK on that, because the UK is a National Health Service, so they can centralize their data collection. So, and they're publishing it, but that is the first thing. We know masks, well, they didn't seem to prevent transmission. People got COVID wearing masks, so that didn't seem to work. So I would invite people to say, we've been given these narratives, did they work? And so did you hear any messaging during COVID about changing your diet?
Vitamin D,
upping your immune function through your pantry, how to do any kind of mind-body work, how to keep your body healthy and exercise. Nothing from our public health institutions. One message from Joe Ladapo, the Surgeon General in Florida. That was it.
Yeah.
And there is so much you can do to boost immune function. Clearly, the solution is in your kitchen. So I would invite everyone to get out of the reptilian brain, the fear-based brain, which has been activated, get into our prefrontal cortex, which is our analytic thinking brain, and say, well, wait a minute, we've survived generations without, we have survived. We're not born with the vaccine and drug absence. So we can figure out how to do this by farm to table, supporting the farmers, cooking again, avoiding ultra-processed foods, getting a basic water filter, getting the kids in the kitchen, and making plant-enriched, plant-forward meals with our children. And when people say they don't know how to cook, I say, YouTube it. YouTube is good for that.
Yes.
Plenty of cooking. Well, those are my recommendations, Jack, as somebody who works with families to get back on track. We can turn this around.
Having the courage to, you probably had the same experience. I lost most of my friends for speaking up, for having the courage to call it what it is. And people thought I'd gone crazy. I was a conspiracy theorist, Trump supporter, whatever. They get it all collapsed. And what are the options? And you mentioned to Build Back Better, which Biden quotes, but it's from the World Economic Forum and our dear friend Klaus Schwab and all of that. And do people know that Governor Newsom, Peter Buttigieg, Trudeau, all these people, they were trained specifically to infiltrate governments. And if you're going to build back better, what does that mean first? You have to destroy. And that's what they've been trained to do, is to destroy. And they're doing a lot of it right here in California.
So I couldn't agree more with you, Jack. And I'd say, well, if that's the case, we cannot necessarily fix those symptoms. Let's create our parallel structures and new systems built and designed on what we see would be the best for our own communities. And for those of us who may have received some negative play and pushback and being disenfranchised by our communities, I got a bit of that too, we can say, well, for those people who are interested, that we are doing things this way, in a different way, in a way that promotes health, togetherness, family, no social distancing, community building,
Hugging.
hugging, based on farming and joy and dancing and singing and bringing back what we love to do. Rebuilding our communities, but in a way that is not based on that narrative, the one that we've been discussing.
One of the things that's going on where I live in Australia near Byron Bay is that groups are getting together and buying farms out in the outback, and then some moving there to live there, and others getting their food from there.
You know, it reminds me, I feel like a Joni Mitchell song, you know, got to get back to the garden, you know, finding Woodstock again. Maybe that's our next book, you know, Jack, Finding Woodstock. But I'm with you. Creating community, farm-based, you know, eco-farms, and getting folks back into growing and that relationship with food and health. And when we rebuild the soil, we rebuild our gut, we rebuild our microbiome, and that is the key for our movement. So focusing on the positive, solutions-based, letting all that, you know, poop go that we've been fed the past few years, it's a lie, and embracing this going forward. And I think we can do it.
I've summarized my career with 6 words. The currency of wellness is connection. And that's what it boils down to, is being connected. I'm glad I got to connect with you through this.
And I think that's a great place to end our
All right.
talk.